Okay, so now that we have our connection to the database file itself, the first thing that we want to do is create a mechanism that allows us to access that database. So to access that database, what I always recommend doing is creating a utility class. A utility class is a static class that does all of your kind of high-level mechanics when interacting with your database. So if you're needing to go and pull users, let's say for example, instead of doing select all from users, where, whatnot, you would actually create a method off of your static utility, and you would say get all users. Inside of that method is then the actual SQL statement of select all users or select all from users. So then in your code, when you're actually doing the work, you call to that utility class and you say get all users. It grabs all the users from the database and gives you back a collection of user objects. So you have this class that kind of sits in between your code and the database, so that if you end up one day realizing, well, I'm no longer going to hit a database, I'm now going to hit a web service. You don't have to go in and rip all the code out everywhere because it's all kind of throughout your application. Instead, you say, all right, I'm going to refactor or rebuild this utility class and make the modifications under the hood inside of those methods. Making those changes there does not affect the rest of your application, but the mechanics of connecting to a database versus a web service all takes place inside of that utility. All right, so we're going to walk through creating one of those. So inside of this app, I'm going to add a new class. And I'm just going to call it my data utility. So I'm going to make this a public static class. Now, can somebody remind me, what does static mean? When I say this is a static class or I'm building a static method.
It's not altered.
Not alter.
You don't manipulate the information which you created.
No. That's a constant. Or read only.
It means that all the variables, just because that doesn't be accessible from other classes without any modification. Because I can't explain it.
Okay.
It makes sense in my head, but I can't
All right.
spit out.
All right. Anybody else? Static? What if I make a method static? Just the method. Going once, going twice. Okay. So, creating something as a static. Just going to drop, I'll just jump into my form load. Creating something as a static means two things. If I make a method static, all methods have to reside inside of a class. If I make the method static, that means that I can access or call that method without creating an instance of the class that holds it. Okay, so let's go back into our data utility. Let's take this out. And let's say public static. We're going to create a users class in a moment. Get all users. So we now have this method. It's a static method. And I want to utilize this method. So this method lives off of data utility. So from my form, I want to get all users. Now with a traditional implementation of a class, the use of a class. You would do something like data utility util equals new data utility, right? You have to create an instance of that class. And then from there, you would say util dot get all users. Here, let me make this modification, and I'll kind of show you how this evolves. You say dot get all users. And that would return a user array of all users. Okay? Let's bump it up for the guys in the back. So, why did I create an instance of this class? The answer is because I had to. Because in order to access this method, I have to create an instance. By making it static, the method is no longer accessible through an instance of the class, but it is accessible if I say data utility dot get all users. A static method is accessible without creating an instance of an object. That line, line 23 that says data utility util equals new data utility, that's considered the instantiation of an object or instantiation of a class. I'm creating an instance of it. I'm taking that blueprint and I'm actually, remember that day I drew a box up here, said I'm carving out some memory. I'm actually creating something. For a normal variable, for a normal object, you have to go through that instantiation process. You have to say, give me some memory, carve it out, make it the shape and size of a data utility. I can now store stuff inside of it. I have properties that are variables that are attached to it. I can store data inside of it. So for a user, we would create a user instance for every user we had because we'd store the first name in the first name property, the last name in the last name property, and so on. For a utility class, traditionally, you don't have as much of a need for actually creating an instance. There's no attributes or metadata around that utility class that you need to instantiate one. You just have these methods, these actions that you want to take, and you need a way of accessing them, and you need a way of kind of like keeping them in a bucket, categorizing them. So this is our data utility. We use it to access data. So by creating static methods, we don't have to create an instance of an object all the time. We just say, hey, off this class, there's this static method that exists that doesn't require me to create an instance. In memory, just create one. Just do it for me one time, and I'm just going to use that same one over and over and over and over again. So these static methods facilitate doing that. Making a class static puts some boundaries around that class. And it basically says to the compiler, if this class is static, everything inside of it must also be static. So if I come back to data utility, right now I can come over here and say public, I don't even know, string name, just some arbitrary property. So if I bring back data utility, if I do util dot, there's name, but you'll notice that I don't have get all users. In order to get access to that, I have to say data utility dot get all users. If I go back into my data utility and I make this static, the compiler, F6, will yell at me and say that this instance property cannot be declared inside of a static class. Within the .NET framework, there are other static classes. This may kind of help bring this all together. There's a math class inside of the .NET framework that contains a lot of math functions. Well, that class is static. All of its methods are static. There's no reason to create an instance of it. You just pass to it, add these two numbers together. Give me the sign of this. Those types of utility classes that serve a purpose, like utility knife, are there to facilitate other work, but you don't create instances of them traditionally. So we're going to create a utility for our data access and have that be a static class as well. All right. So before we get into actually filling this in, if you go under your Server Explorer, you may have to go View, Server Explorer to get it to show up. Normally it's located on the left side. You'll see that Visual Studio automatically identifies that connection from your app config, and it'll create an instance of your MDF so that you can connect to it and see your tables. If for some reason you don't have the full functionality to be able to manipulate this database, I've run into this before. I know the reason why, and I can work with you one-on-one, or if there's a group of you, I can give you the workaround. SQL Server Management Studio also allow you to connect. You use basically the same connection string parameters to connect for SSMS. All right, so right now this is empty. So all I want to first do is create a table. I'm going to add new table. I'm just going to call this table users. On my design surface load. And I'm just going to put in some properties. Or I'm sorry, not properties, but fields. So hopefully this is pretty familiar to you, going in and creating tables. You've got your field name, you've got your data type for that field, so just like your variables have different types, your fields have different types as well. You can store strings, you can store numbers, you can store date times, bits. Bits traditionally are used for booleans, so bits, 1s and 0, but they're treated as true and false. Now you may notice what I'm doing here is I'm saying nvarchar 400 for all of these. What's a varchar? Variable character. Nvarchar is? What? No. It is a non-local variable character. It's UTF encoded. Instead of ANSI or ASCII encoded, which is varchar, nvarchar uses the UTF or Unicode encoding. So you get a larger character set for things like, I think traditionally they talk about them like Chinese or Arabic characters, so you have that broader spectrum. The reason I'm choosing 400, anybody guess? It is a large size, but I could make it a max, and it'll fill up as much physical disk space as possible. So why am I choosing 400? Because it's my favorite number. No. Close. It's more than enough in most cases. The reason I'm choosing 400 specifically is when you're creating indexes on your database tables. You guys know what indexes are? So when you create an index, you're basically telling the database engine to go in and create a lookup reference for that field. Indexable fields, if you create an index on a field, the field cannot be any larger than 900 bytes. A Unicode character is 16 bytes. So if you do the math, 16 times 400, it's some number that's, I think it's like 450 or 480 or something like that. But 400 is a good round number to always remember. So basically you're saying this is the largest string I can store in memory and still make it indexable. I can still search on it. All right. I won't go into all the details, but basically when you index a field, your searches are a lot faster. If you don't index, you do what's called a table scan, and it's basically walking one record at a time, checking it. It's doing it ridiculously fast because it's, they're high-powered database servers, but it's not as fast or as efficient as doing it on an indexed field. So something you want to stick in your back pocket is that your database fields, if they're nvarchar, 400 is the best number. Somewhere between 4 and 480, I believe, is the best number because they're still indexable. There is a varchar max, which basically means you can make it infinitely long, infinitely in size. As much disk space as you have, but they are not indexable. So here's my treat for the day. All right, so table, properties. I'm going to mark my ID as my identity field so that it'll auto number for me. If you don't do that, it's going to expect you to put a number in there. And then I'll hit update. And what this is going to do is going to generate a create script. I'll go ahead and run it. And this script, which is basically this statement down below if you're curious, is the SQL to create that table. So if we go back in here and we hit refresh in the upper left, we now have a user's table. We can right click on this table and we can say show table data, and it'll give us back an empty table, which is what it is. So we can come in here and say Kevin Gantos. And I can just start filling in data. So we now have a database. We now have data inside of it. We can now go through and actually pull that data out using our utility class.